Why do men have trouble with expressing emotions, or why do men shut down when faced with hard things or things that could be emotionally charged and that sort of thing? One thing I will say before I get into that is when we say the phrase mental health, I think a lot of people tend to think of that in a negative way. But, one of the things that I think we're learning a lot about, and I think in particular since the COVID epidemic, we think of mental health as something that it negatively affects us, but actually, I think a better way to think about it is a mental health, our mental space um, affects most everything we do in life. And so we all have this conversation going on in our heads most of the time about different things. It might just be thoughts about different people, different relationships, but all of us have that going on all of the time, except when we're asleep, maybe, but then it comes out in dreams and that sort of thing. So it's a normal part of being a human, just our thinking and the way that we feel. And so one of the things that I think one reason why men maybe struggle with expressing feelings is that the big one is that we're socially programmed to kind of be that way. So it's a lot of social learning, it's you know, that whole stereotypical thing, big boys don't cry, men need to keep a stiff upper lip, men need to show that they're strong, men need to suck it up, not be vulnerable, all of those messages that we hear growing up. I can remember even as a kid, if you fell down and got hurt and you scraped your knee or whatever, kind of the attitude was just rub some dirt in it and keep going, kind of thing. And so we're kind of programmed with that growing up. And I think there's also some biological kind of reasons or just something that has occurred over evolutionary times. And you look at other species, the men are the men or male of the species tend to be the ones that kind of do the herding, the collecting of partners. They also are there to protect the herd, so to speak. I think about wild horses, and they've got the stallion that will protect the female part of the herd from any predators, but also other men and that sort of thing. So there's kind of a biological wiring in there for us to be strong, for us to fight, for us to fix things. And that's another thing too, is that with our social learning, when emotions come up, particularly negative emotions, we tend to want to rid ourselves of that. We want to fix the problem. And so I think particularly in relationships and particularly heterosexual relationships, and it happens in homosexual relationships as well, one person, particularly the male, when a problem comes up as far as seeing their partner upset or they see their partner not happy with something, they want to fix it. And so what that comes across as is just them trying to be controlling or trying to discount what the other person is feeling and that sort of thing. And so I think a lot of that just gets programmed into us. Men are just kind of wired to be, like I said, fixers and also to divide and conquer and move on to the next thing. Whereas for women, I think most of the time, women are much more emotionally focused and kind of programmed that way or learn that socially to be more about the relationship and about building solidarity within a relationship. And so it's not that they want their problems fixed as much as they want understanding about what their internal world is like. I think the other thing that happens when in the brain, when we experience any sort of negative emotions, whether it's fear, whether it is hurt, whether it is anger, all of those kinds of things, our brain automatically goes to a fight or flight mode. And particularly when people have a traumatic background, in other words, they've had experience different levels of trauma. Maybe it's they grew up in an alcoholic family, or maybe they've been in harm's way. I think about first responders or people that are serving in the military and that sort of thing, and have been in the heat of battle, that kind of thing. With what that does is it kind of imprints on that part of our brain called the amygdala that is there to protect us, puts us into that fight or flight mode. And so it's very hard for a lot of people, particularly men who have been in those situations, to kind of override that in their brain. And so they're hyper vigilant. They're always looking for danger, and it's just internally in there. And so when negative emotions come up, that part of the brain doesn't distinguish between danger and something that's difficult. Having conflict with your partner is a difficult situation, not necessarily a dangerous situation. Except, if you grew up in a family where those things were happening, where maybe you had an unpredictable parent. And so maybe somebody grew up in a family where, as I like to frame it, there were a lot of surprises where maybe the parents were kind of unpredictable because of addiction issues, that kind of thing, or rage or anger within the family. Those things can create in us trauma symptoms. And a lot of people are familiar with the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in which, as I like to say, our amygdala, that part of our brain that protects us, is responding much better than it should, so to speak, in difficult situations. And so they feel dangerous. That is one reason, and that can affect both male and females. But I think the other thing is that I think most men, a lot of men, don't necessarily have, or not really, didn't really learn the language for feelings. And so being able to express what you feel is sometimes difficult. I always kid around, and maybe there's some truth to it, is that men basically have 5 emotions, and that's mad, sad, glad, hungry, and horny. So, I mean, that's being overly simplistic, and I'm being kind of sarcastic here. But, men just don't have, or haven't really learned. I think a lot of men haven't learned the vocabulary for expressing feelings. And so I know, even for me, and I'm a therapist and trained in dealing with emotions and that sort of things, a lot of times it is difficult for me to access what I'm feeling. I know that maybe I'm feeling sad, or maybe feeling a little depressed, but I don't really know how to access what's underneath all of that, what might be driving that for me. And a lot of times it's things like loneliness, or things like just grief, those kinds of emotions that can tend to drive those things. And I think a lot of times, too, for men, in their difficulty in expressing emotions, is that I think a lot of times for men, it feels like, okay, if I let any of this out, or allow myself to express any of this, it's just going to be a big explosion and I'm going to lose control. In other words, it's just going to be too overwhelming for me to be able to explain this, or talk about this, or put it in a way that my partner or my spouse can even comprehend. That's, I think, a big part of it. Big things is that I think one reason that men have difficulty expressing emotions, it's something that we learn socially. It's part of our culture, particularly here in Western cultures in the United States. I think in other cultures it becomes easier. It's more acceptable to express emotions. The other thing is that I think with that social learning, it teaches us to kind of go into this protective mode, and that we don't want to be seen as vulnerable or weak, that kind of thing. And so those are some thoughts on that. Love to hear your comments. You can leave those down below. And also take time to follow us or subscribe to the channel here. And I'll be having some more clips here just about men's mental health, or why men do what we do from the emotional standpoint. So take care, folks, and we'll be back with some more episodes.